All right, welcome back. I'm here with Sheree Atcheson of Peakon. Sheree, how you doing?
Hey everybody, I'm good. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining me today. I mean, I'm really excited about this topic, and I understand you all are doing some innovative work in the space and really how data and analytics can help shed light not only on what's happening, but what appropriate action to take. So, if you would introduce yourself and a little bit more about what you're going to be sharing.
Yeah, of course. So I am Peakon's Global Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, where I own and lead our inclusion work internally, but also own the vision for our Include product, which helps companies understand people from all different backgrounds around what they feel around inclusion, diversity, non-discrimination. And I spend a lot of time with our customers and clients, helping them bring their inclusion strategies to life with the products that we have. So I'm super excited today to talk to you about how to put your insights to work and how you can measure and improve these things that are incredibly important to all the work that we're doing.
Yes, I agree. They're incredibly important. And I'm going to get out of your way and let you talk about this important stuff, and then we'll have a chat at the end. All right?
Perfect, sounds good. I will just share my screen. Like I said, I'm here to talk to you about putting your insights to work. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce myself, I guess. Why am I here? Why am I talking to you today? So I am at Nirashika on Twitter, if you're that way inclined, and we are at Peakon team. I am a multi-award-winning DE&I leader globally for my services to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've been doing this work for almost a decade now. Which I'm super proud of. I'm an advisory board member at Women Who Code, which is the world's largest nonprofit globally dedicated to women in technology. I write for Forbes regularly on privilege, on racism, on anti-racism, on creating equitable technology systems. And I'm a keynote speaker, which hopefully you'll see today. And I'm also a published author of Demanding More, which is a book that is here to teach us about how the world has been purposefully exclusive so we can be purposefully inclusive moving forward. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about this, and I want to take you on a journey. I will ask you some questions that I want you to sit back and have a think about in your head, and please do that whenever we're talking through. So can companies truly measure if they're inclusive? Now, we see quite a lot of companies publishing annual diversity, equity, and inclusion reports. But are they actually DE&I reports, or are they diversity reports? So, for example, we see Facebook, for example, sharing demographic data to really measure if they're inclusive, to measure their progress. So they've gone from a workforce that's 3% Black to around 3.8 in the past 6 years. Now, that is not a huge amount of change in 6 years, and I want you to think about why that is. Do we have metrics without consequences? If we base all of our success measures on representation, what about the flip side of that? What about the flip side of the coin? What about inclusion? Now, what do we need to do? CEOs need to ensure that we have inclusive people decisions. Now, people decisions span the entire business, and we know that this is important to people. We know that employees value companies that stand up to unfair treatment and that are willing to use their brand for the greater good, being willing to put themselves out there and say, actually, we know we need to do better with this. We know that we are listened to, and therefore we will hold other organizations, people, and leadership to account. And this is how we're going to do it. Important social movements have fueled this kind of progress, certainly around Me Too and the globalization of the Black Lives Matter movements last year. Now, what's important is what we do moving forward. These dramatic inflection points cannot just be inflection points. We have to keep going. We have to keep doing things. And we know that we have a whole generational and demographic change going on in our workplaces right now. It's more multidimensional, it's more ethnically diverse, and it's got a real strong working hybrid, especially when we talk about what's happening right now when it comes to COVID-19, how we're all working in ways that typically we aren't used to. We see big talent moving around quite a lot, and we have to pivot and change to capture those people, to attract those people, and to keep those people. I want us to really think about the keeping those people when we're in this conversation. We're not just attracting, we're trying to keep them. We want to retain them in this conversation. Now we know that culture add is incredibly important here. Culture fit is not what we're talking about. And it's important that we have organization processes that really embrace and celebrate and allow people from all different backgrounds with different insights, perceptions, and so on to make that company better and stronger. Now, what's important here is actually culture add is a lovely phrase, but how do you do that? How do you measure if your culture works for all different people? How do you measure if it works for, let's say, disabled people versus non-disabled people? What about disabled people of color? What about very specifically Black women that are disabled and so on? How are you measuring that? Can you measure that? And I want you to think about that. Are you doing that right now? The last year, certainly, I keep forgetting we're in 2021 now because time doesn't mean anything anymore. But this isn't a nice to have anymore, okay? It's a business necessity. We saw last year at the start of the global pandemic that global DE&I roles, senior leadership roles such as my own, were one of the roles that were cut statistically higher than they would have expected to be. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that people have viewed this work as not a necessity, as something that could be trimmed away when you cut away the fat. But then when we saw after the murder of George Floyd in the middle of the summer, we saw a significant uptick in those roles being hired again. And we still see that, the amount of roles that are being rehired and so on. So what does that mean? It means it's a necessity, but it also means that we have to ensure that those people hired into those roles are, one, not tokenized, and two, have the ability to make real, meaningful, and the key word here is sustainable change. So you'll probably all know this, but I'm going to talk to you about it anyway. Inclusive approaches lead to better team and company performance. So from our own engagement product, Engage, we can see that high engagement leads to high productivity, 50% of a difference. And when we know, again, the workforce is more diverse, we've seen studies from McKinsey, from Deloitte, and so on, that back this up. Now, the reason for this is team collaboration, okay? We have different perspectives, different insights, frictions before we make decisions. We're not rushing to make decisions. We are removing echo chambers. But I want you to think about how you're doing that right now. How are you gathering insights from everyone in your company? One, not just those that are in leadership positions. Two, not just those that are comfortable sharing. And three, those that feel like they are psychologically safe enough to speak out. What's also important here is the culture add piece that we spoke about. Team collaboration cannot just be within the teams that are homogeneous. It has to be within the entire organization. Diversity without inclusion is fruitless. And I want us to remember that because it's incredibly important. Now, quite a lot of us are probably working in companies where innovation revenue is incredibly important. You know, you're making new things, you're changing the way things are, you're reworking and building from scratch. And we need innovation revenue to do that, which increases by 20% when we have different perspectives, when we have diverse teams and inclusive leadership. And this is really important that your culture evolves and grows. Take a second to think about what your culture was like at the start of 2020. Think about what it was like in April 2020. Think about what it was like in September 2020, December 2020, and then now in January 2021. Now, I know our organizations have changed probably a lifetime's worth in that very short space of time, but how have you pivoted? How is your tooling pivoted? How are you measuring inclusion and understanding what people need in a way that actually fits for something that is changing so quickly? We know that when organizations are not diverse and they're not equitable, that they're losing trust of their employees, and that results in disengagement, loss of productivity, high attrition rates, and low retention rates. And these are things we all want to avoid. But what's key here is that business as usual is very frankly not cutting it. Okay, we've been doing this work in various different ways for decades, and it's not cutting it. Okay, we're seeing a lack of inclusivity. So whilst the majority of people feel like their organization is diverse, only 29% actually believe that it's inclusive. Think about that. Think about 29% are only rating it as inclusive. Chief diversity officers such as myself are not empowered. Now think about the significant hiring increase of CDOs in the last year, but yet many don't have executive sponsorship, they don't have the accountability they need, and the resources to drive change. What's really important here is that these people are not tokenized, it's not performative, And it's actually something that is there aligned with the business goals, because diversity, inclusion, and business KPIs are all the one thing. And it's important that we're not separating them. However, lines of accountability are really mixed up here. And we have to think about how we're actually going to empower the people we hire in. I wrote a piece for Forbes on this a few months ago on you're hiring a senior DE&I leader. Here's how to embed success. And it takes us through all of those different things. You know, what are you trying to fix? Why are you trying to fix it? What's the skill set? Are you conflating passion for skill set? And what do we need to do to really set those people up for success? We know that action is needed, okay? We can't just have reporting. We know that big tech companies have been releasing reports certainly for the last 6 to 7 years, and not a lot has changed. We need action that doesn't just engage senior leadership, but middle management. We know that middle management is the frozen middle, the missing rung on the ladder. And if we don't engage the people in the middle, the people that all of the rest of your employees interact with day to day on an operational level, then we don't change the problem. Now, we're really here to help create a systemic approach to inclusion. Now, I talk quite a lot there, as I tend to do. Do you track inclusion within your organization? What do you do right now? Maybe what's going through your head is, okay, yes, I have an applicant tracking system, so I see where people fall out of my pipeline in the hiring piece. Okay, I track attrition rates. Okay, I track retention rates and promotion rates. Do you put protected characteristic data over the top of that, such as, you know, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity, and so on, gender as well? Think about, what does tracking inclusion mean to you right now? Now, what is important here is a proactive and integrated DE&I approach around attraction, retention, and talent development. Now, we need to measure how people interact with and perceive inclusion, and this perception data is incredibly powerful. What do people feel like in your business from different backgrounds? What does it mean to feel included? What does it mean around fair opportunities and management support for different people? Actions. What actions are you doing right now? Maybe you've rolled out a learning path or something, or you have ad hoc training, but actually, what meaningful, regular actions are you providing to that middle rung and that top rung? Team leaders, the people that are interacting with your people day to day, around, you know, inclusive ways of working, around challenging bias, around micro courses on privilege awareness, and so on. What are you doing in that space? Are you doing something? Do you have a tool that provides those managers, for example, with a tailored reach out email that shares all of the things that we think you need to do based on the insights that we're seeing from your team? And what's the outcome here? We spoke about this at the start, but we're talking about DE&I being applied in all daily decisions, not just when it comes to, okay, it's International Women's Day or it's Black History Month, let's run an event. Okay, community is one very small part of DE&I. What's actually really, really important is your process change, your policy change, and your ability to create equitable environments. And you can only do that if you're actively including DE&I in all of those daily decisions. So at Peakon, we're here to make work for everyone. Now, I was a Peakon customer before they asked me to come and work here and lead all of this work. And I've used it. I've used it on my own work. I use it internally. And ultimately, what it helps you do is answer these 3 different things. So 1, who actually works here? Who is in the business? How do people self-identify? And what are the underrepresented people in your business from all of the different characteristics that may be important to you? Allowing you to capture that in a GDPR compliant way. Also allowing you to set up, for example, different schedules so you can ask the different things you need to ask depending on your region. So obviously in some places you maybe can't ask certain things. It allows you to facilitate that. So again, you get the tailored approach you need while still moving forward in a sustainable way. Feedback. Now, we all know how important feedback is, okay? You can't move things along without knowing what's happening. And what we see quite a lot of organizations doing is doing a point-in-time feedback. Now, what that means is ultimately you know what happens right now because you posted a listening session, a one-to-one, or a facilitated group conversation with your employee resource groups. But that's a singular point in time. It's also biased because only certain people will share with you. And 3, it's only for people that feel psychologically safe in vocalizing this stuff. What about everybody else? What about the majority of your company? Everybody needs to have a channel to voice their concerns in a way that provides you the analytics that you need to move forward. Actions and trainings. Now, what training and behavioural changes do you need? And why do you need them? Again, taking the legwork out, helping you understand what the most impactful actions are based on the different things we see, such as non-discrimination decreasing, for example, or inclusiveness decreasing. What are the things we think that are coming up? And actually understanding how your people communicate, providing you the different topics that we see continuing to come up because your people keep writing them in comments. Thinking about that as opposed to language processing that just uses a list, actually analysing how your people speak so you get a really true understanding. Now, reporting is key here, okay? Reporting internally and externally. What are you sharing? How are you sharing it? When are you sharing it? And why are you sharing it? Remembering that reporting must not just be on diversity demographic data. Inclusion reporting is incredibly important here. And what we need is certainly a tool that takes the legwork out of trying to create all of those analytics, but actually helping you understand it in real time, right away when you roll out your survey and you roll out the platform. As soon as it's used and people's answers start to come in and so on, all anonymous, you see that score. You see what's happening. You see if you've rolled out an initiative, whether your score increases or decreases. It helps you measure your success, as well as measuring failure, which is incredibly important. So Peakon Include is really here around representing every employee group. And that means every single one you want to ask for those questions, those protected characteristic questions, making sure that everyone's voice is heard via a standardized methodology and data set, intelligent listening and discrimination channels, where you can have anonymous conversations with people, again, prioritizing psychological safety, but still allowing you to capture that information that you need. Empowering your managers, again, with that training, that guidance, and those insights that are tailored to them. It's not a printed out report that they have to figure out by themselves. It is tailored to them specifically. And again, this is one of the things, having done this work for almost a decade, is whenever it takes a lot of admin and work, it gets pushed to the side because it's laborious, the same as any task. When we take out that legwork, when we take out those admin, that admin heavy stuff and so on, people are engaged more. People are ready to do this. People have accountability. Measuring progress and impact is incredibly important here. And again, how it measures against your key business metrics. So I couldn't come and talk about Peakon without saying, what we're doing internally using our own platform. So I developed the strategy at the end of last year. I joined in September and we launched this in October. And we have a 15-month strategy that takes us to the end of this year, which is focused on foundational bases around data, engagement, teach, and action. So engage is really when we're aiming to engage and listen to all Peakons, understanding what does work and what doesn't work. Taking people on an authentic journey of inclusion education around microaggressions, anti-racism, privilege awareness, bias, and so on, and baking that into our learning paths, making it part of the progression and part of our onboarding. So again, we set the tone from the very beginning. We set the tone around certainly interviewing. So for example, you cannot be an interviewer at Peakon if you have not completed the mandatory inclusive interviewing training and so on. And we're rolling out another learning path that takes us to the end of this year and then rolls over this month. And then action. Listening without action is fruitless. Nobody wants to talk to a brick wall. So we provide a very clear set of actions, which you can read more about in the DE&I report that we're doing. But actually using our platform, what's really important here is the highlights that we found. We're very transparent. We know that we're on a journey internally. We know we have to do things better. But if we don't have the insights, how could you do that? So firstly, from a representation perspective, we can see that 46% of Peakons overall and 40% of our senior management team identify as women. What we do see is that women score 8.1 on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and men score 8.3. And we actually see differences in all of the specific questions when it comes to diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to do more. We need to help focus more on our processes, making sure they work for people of all different genders. It means we need to start to look at sponsorship programs because we've seen a difference in management support as well as inclusiveness and belonging. And it means that we need to start focusing in on partnerships as well. So we know we need to focus in on different areas based on this. And certainly from an ethnicity perspective, we saw mixed heritage Peakons score the highest on DE&I out of all ethnicities. So mixed heritage Peakons scored 9, black Peakons scored 8.5, white Peakons scored 8.4, Asian Peakon 8.0, prefer not to say 6.8, and other ethnicity 6.0. Now, what's incredibly important here is see that prefer not to say is really useful information, because clearly that's a lower score than the rest. So we know we need to do work on the population that doesn't feel comfortable sharing those insights. Now, what we can do is pulling the insights from include and engage around management support, loyalty, reward, culture add, values, and have a really good conversation around it. What we do is we look at the scores of all of our senior management team every quarter. I analyze the engagement and inclusion related metrics, and I create a report for them with accountability of actions that they have to complete in that quarter. Again, embedding accountability with progress. And progress is incredibly important here. So we've defined our progress indicator off of our include score, our risk indicator. So if something goes bad and our score goes down, we have a risk plan that we put into place right away to make sure that we're addressing this. And again, we're on our overall diversity and inclusion data disclosure rate of 75 to 80% by the end of Q4 this year. So we can start to look at targets in line with census data and so on. Analytics is incredibly important to us. As you can probably tell, it's probably important to you too, because you're here. So we have our first ever online community conference at the end of the year called Every Voice Counts, at the start of the year. So it's February this next month. And we're discussing all of the insights we've gathered from our data sets around the change in approach to inclusion. After the murder of George Floyd, we can see the change in how people of color versus white people versus white men and so on have responded. And we'll reveal the actual roadmap for the product as well. So it's free to sign up, and you can find that link online if you search Every Voice Counts at Peakon. So I hope that has been useful for you. Again, I'm at Nirashika on Twitter, and you can get us at Peakon Team or peakon.com if you want to speak to the member of the team. But I am excited to go to questions. So I think we're waiting for Hal. There we go.
Coming back. I'm right here, Sheree. That's fantastic. And I am so glad that we can slow down a little bit and just talk about this, because there's so much to delve into there. And just for context, two things. Number one, we hosted a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Day a couple weeks ago, and it was very intense. It was very emotional for me personally. In talking with Black people and their struggles here in the United States and around the world, Indigenous people around the world, women who are still being treated unfairly, compensation-wise in the workplace, the misogyny that still exists, unfortunately, and also LGBTQ members that also have very visibly been discriminated against. So where I want to start with this. Actually, there's one more thing. I said two things. The other thing is thank you. I mean, based on your background and what you have contributed to this space and this discussion and advancing it has been not only commendable but hugely important. So thank you for sharing today. So given your background and experience, and also given kind of the weight that I am carrying in the wake of the event of a couple weeks ago, a few things emerged for me, and I'd like to get your take and advice on behalf of the community. And we can, again, voice your own questions in the Q&A section or the feed, and we'll get to them if we can, as many as we can. But my question is this, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been important for organizations for a long time. So let's just say 20 years. And there have been diversity, equity, inclusion leaders or D&I leaders hired at a reasonably high level, say VP level. They've been part of diversity councils. They've been influencing leadership teams. However, they have been under-resourced. They have had little teams, if anybody, supporting them. So their impact has been kind of tangential, almost check the box type thing, as opposed to core on how talent is selected, developed, internal mobility, all aspects of how a talent strategy is formulated. So my question is this, as we move forward, and you alluded to this in your presentation, how do we sustain this, not only as a initiative to check the box to say we're doing it, but how do we make it become part of how we do things here in this organization, we probably have to get beyond just this one person, or how do you see this happening?
Yeah, I think what's really important is firstly that people understand where they're at the moment. Now, what we see, and one of the reasons why I think, and I talk about this a lot in my book, that I think we move forward and we aren't as successful as what we would like, is because we don't spend the time actually analyzing where we're at first. So defining lofty goals that you don't know where you're at in position to doesn't work. And what we really need to do is be really, really specific. And very often when it comes to inclusion-related initiatives, they aren't very specific. And that's a problem, because let's think about how you develop a product or an engineering solution. You are very specific about the tasks you have to complete. And we have to do the same thing with inclusion. Now, for us to be sustainable moving forward, you are correct. It cannot just be, the me's doing that kind of stuff. And what's really important is how you tie this into your business goals. Now, you've seen quite a lot of organizations coming forward and saying, they're tying diversity to their C-suite salaries and so on, but also making sure that you tie this to your business KPIs. So, for example, in Peakon, certainly what we are doing is the SMT, the senior management team scorecards that I give them every quarter are being tied to their KPIs for every quarter as well. And also thinking about how does your business growth relate to inclusion? And again, we tie that to our inclusion related scoring and also our hiring. But you have to think about what stage are you at in your business. Certainly if you're a startup or a scale up, it's really important that you prioritize this now, because trying to fix it retrospectively is very difficult. But if you're a legacy company or a much bigger company that's already existed for quite a while, you need to start thinking now about how you engage that senior leadership team with those inclusive values and principles to make sure that that bleeds down to middle management. But what you also need to do is have a process in place for when that does not happen. Because it's all well and good to say, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z, but what happens if your chief tech officer doesn't do it? Who is going to hold him accountable or her accountable or them accountable? Who is going to do that? And that means having a process in place that means, some of your most senior people will need to be held accountable. And that's a really important part of this that sometimes doesn't happen.
Well, and you're alluding to something that came to light by multiple speakers a couple weeks ago and over time, is that this, number one, is uncomfortable. It's disrupting the status quo in many cases. And it's also, to your point, not allowing the hiding, not allowing the behavior that is unfair. Then that means there needs to be a proactive movement. And so let me frame the question this way. I have been personally going through this exploration. Number one, what does being an ally mean? And this gentleman out of the UK who talked about being an ally in training. And we're constantly working to be a better ally, which stopped me in my tracks, because I view myself as an ally, but I can always get better. The thing about it is that organizations were created to do something of, in most cases, commercial value, right? And they're not a platform for activism. However, we cannot just check our humanity at the door.
Yep.
So we need to balance, this platform to do business, but to also, create this fair and just environment. The latter, to your point, takes work. It takes intervention. It takes fixing what's wrong. And I have found, particularly if leaders have been in role for 20, 30, if not longer years, they're making good money. They don't want to rock the boat too much. So what do you say about the need to be courageous, to be proactive, and create the accountability measures, the accountability processes that are really going to drive meaningful change, so we're not in a similar place 3, 4, 5, years down the road?
I think what we really need to start to view and do around DE&I is being proactive instead of reactive. And what we see quite now is certainly, senior leadership being reactive. Okay, something has went wrong. How do I fix it? Okay, something has happened in society. I need to step up and I don't know how to step up. What we need to actually have is people consistently thinking about this throughout their business experience, throughout their business life cycle, and not just when things go wrong. Because what happens with that is it becomes very tokenistic and very performative, because we should be thinking about this all the way around and all of the time. And the key thing here, whenever we talk about allyship is an incredibly important part of this. Because allyship is not just personal, it's systemic as well. So allyship isn't just what, let's say I do or you do as a person, but it's about what our business processes need to do as well, changing on systemic levels, really addressing the bias that may exist through analyzing whether, person X is being promoted and why not, who's given growth opportunities and why not, and so on. And what's really, really important about allyship is, it is a journey and people are brought on that journey. But to do that, we also must spend time understanding why people may be resisting it as well. And very often it's due to a lack of education, it's due to a lack of awareness. And it can also be down to, very frankly, being sexist, racist, and homophobic, and ableist, and so on. And again, that's what that process that I'm talking about, that if it's actually important to your organization and you have people that are really pushing against it because of those things, you have to have a decision whether that is the person that should be in the organization or not. And we need people to start to think about that, because if we only care about business metrics, then don't pretend that you care about inclusion, because this is a problem. Like, we see organizations saying things, people join the company, and then they're like, oh, I thought this place was better, but actually it's just the same. They just have really good marketing. Yeah. And that's what we need to start doing. And I think, certainly as a senior leader, both in myself and yourself, holding those people to account, holding those organizations, whether you're in them or not, is really important. And we need more people, more allies like us to do that. And, I'm on an allyship journey as well. Whilst I'm a woman of color, I can certainly work to be an ally to the Black community because I'm not a Black woman. And certainly around people that have worse disabilities than I do, members of the LGBT plus community, and so on. So it's really important that we understand that nuance of allyship as well, that it isn't just about, for example, white men being allies. We need a lot of people to be engaged in this, and that includes people like me as well, who are also, I describe myself as underrepresented yet privileged at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great level of self-awareness, and just based on what you just shared, I would probably put myself in that category as well. And as there's a couple of things that I want to get to, and one is around your personal journey, because I want to have this in context a little bit, and the other, frankly, is Peakon, because you are an influencer. You are, you write for Forbes, you could do a lot of things. And so let's just start with that second piece first, if you don't mind. I have my own narrative about why you've committed to Peakon, but I'll let you share, because I think it's great. I mean, it kind of brings a practical application to what you've been advocating. But in your own words, what's your journey been to be where you are right now?
I'm very technically minded. So I have a computer science degree. I used to be a software engineer, and I've always, when I've been doing DE&I work, I've always taken a very analytical approach as well as an empathetic approach. And the reason I do that is because measurement is really important to me, because what gets measured gets done. And when I was using Peakon, before I came to work here, it allowed me to gather the insights in a way that I needed, that wasn't extra legwork, that wasn't extra admin that I didn't need to do, and that was really meaningful in the way that it did it. And I actually, before I joined Peakon, I was helping them shape the product sort of in an ad hoc consulting way as a favor of being on the beta for the Include product that I now lead. And it was through that it became very clear to me that myself and Peakon take a very similar mindset when it comes to inclusion, and that what they needed was someone with the expertise that I had, with the awareness and education that I had, to really elevate this fantastic product and bring it in a way that was able to really change the narrative when it came to measuring inclusion. And for me, that was just a really good fit. The reason as well is that I only do DE&I roles that are both focused on internal DE&I and a product, because I love using the technical background that I have and being able to lead the internal stuff and lead the product with our chief product officer has been a fantastic experience, exactly what I wanted from my next step. And so that's why I said yes to Peakon and not to all the other people that were trying to get me to say yes.
Well, again, I am glad you made this decision, because I think there's a significant delta between the aspiration of what an organization wants to do with DE&I and the actual making it happen. And so what I see you doing personally and as a firm is bridging that gap. There's a question that came in from Haley. Can you give examples of how to weave DEI into the fabric of a company, into the project, life cycle or project, management processes as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, your values are incredibly important here. Now, your values quite often shouldn't just be words on a page, but inclusion should be intertwined into all of them. And you really need to consider it from the different parts of the business that they are relevant to. So, for example, at Peakon, when I came in, we decided to rework our values and make sure that inclusion was intertwined into all of them, but then really making sure that we provided very clear understanding of what it meant to, for example, raise the bar in sales, what that means in engineering, what that means in product, what it means in the people team, because it's very specific. And when you have specificness and it's not vague, it's inclusive, because there's no room for miscommunication. Whenever you talk about actually communicating that into, like, say, firstly, the employee life cycle, your people should be promoted based on values and not just delivery, because you always have the trope of the brilliant jerk, that they're brilliant at their job, but they're actually a horrible person.
Right.
And it's important that the journey is part of the promotion. So how did this person get from A to Z? Not just that they got to Z, but the process that they did, and did it live the values and why? When it comes to actually the project cycle and creating an inclusive product and technology product specifically, you have to have checks and balances at every single stage of the process. And I wrote a Forbes piece on this too, because it's really important to me. When I was a software engineer, I was an engineer on quite a lot of high profile public sector projects. So they affected millions of people. And what's important is that at every stage you ask yourself the question, have I gathered, for example, the requirements of all different people? That means I really understand what this process needs to look like, this product needs to look like. When you go into development, have I developed with different user personas? Have I done appropriate user research to make sure that it will match the needs of what I'm talking about? Testing it as well. Is the data set diverse? Is it an appropriate data set for the communities that I'm going to roll it out to? And again, deployment. How are we deploying it? What tooling are we using? And how are we reaching communities that may be harder to reach if it's certainly an online tool? What about those that don't have access? What about those with poor backgrounds? And it is about asking yourself those questions at every stage. Now, does that mean that your delivery will slow down? Yes, because it means that you're putting friction in place before you rush to make a decision. But that's inclusion. You're not rushing, you're taking the time, you're assessing, and then you make a decision.
I absolutely love it. And I just want to go deeper on that real quick, because when you start asking the questions and you have these wickets, for lack of a better term, those questions invite the opportunity to include measures or data. And oftentimes these data don't exist. One of the things that I get like this, because earlier in my career, I would have this HR strategy and diversity and inclusion would be there, and here would be some initiatives, and then on the far right would be, how are we going to measure it? And I'm like, time out. How about involving me at the outset of the process and in the question formulation process, and then we can identify what's most appropriate to measure to generate the insight downstream. So, with that as a framing, how would you encourage leaders and analysts to think about how to get the appropriate data within a process as you described?
You need to engage the right people. And I've done this in quite a lot of organizations, because some organizations are much more comfortable with data than others. Certainly, like when I came to Peakon, it's very easy for me to talk about data because we're a database company. When we're talking about different organizations, it's not as easy. Now, what I would suggest is that you start off small if you have to. You don't have to start off with a strategy that is capturing data for, let's say, 10 characteristics to make an impact. Define a focus that you know will still be impactful. Now, maybe that's one area or two areas, maybe it's gender and ethnicity, or maybe it's something else, but being very, very succinct and clear about why you're asking for that data of the people that you need to get approval with whether that's in your C-suite and so on. What will help you evolve that conversation is the transparency and accountability along the way. And again, what you will need to do is talk about, what you've done with it, why it's been useful, how it's fueled X, Y, Z, or give you insights, and why you want to ask more pieces of information. And again, the intersectionality piece is important here. People don't exist in boxes. People, like, I don't exist as like a woman and a person of color and someone from a poor background. I exist as all of those things at once, and that's just the way the world works. So it's important that when you go on this conversation, on this journey, you start to see those different ideas with people that maybe don't understand them just yet, or haven't had exposure to that kind of language. So as you move on that journey, you get to that end state. Now, quite a lot of customers that I spend time with, are at the very start of their journey, and they don't know what they want to ask. And that's fine, because the point is you don't have to ask everything at once. Using something that allows you to ask things easily whenever you want to change it is also what you need. But comms plans are incredibly important here, because if you don't have a succinct comms plan when it comes to asking this kind of data, evolving these kinds of things around values and so on, people disengage because they think you're making decisions without asking them, that you're not including them in the process, and that their insights don't matter. And you know what happens when people think their insights don't matter. So.
Right. And, so what I'm hearing in that is that the data that you would collect and the insights that you would generate, while there might be some salient measures and metrics, organization to organization, having the conversation would help prioritize the data that would be most appropriate. And even in some cases, it would be unique to that organization. Is that a fair playback?
Absolutely. It's absolutely tailored to organizations, because what's important is that you think about, one, the size of your organization, the field that it's in, the industry, for example, the regions that it's in, and the cultures that play into this, the different nuances that you're talking about here. Again, when you're talking about big companies, everything has to be really deliberate, obviously. Like, if you make a change and it affects 100,000 people, that's 100,000 people. When you make a change in, let's say, a company that's 250 people, you're given a bit more leeway because it's a smaller number of people that have likely a smaller knit community. So you have to consider all of these things. And it's why whenever I'm talking to people about this and I'm doing consulting with it, I really ask them not to rush. And one of the things you touched on, certainly around the last few months and the last year, is around the evolution of DE&I. And what we have seen is a lot of people rushing to try and fix things now. Like, it needed to be fixed two hours ago, and right. It doesn't work like that. And what we need people to do is actually slow down, take a step back, and then move forward, as opposed to trying to sprint to the finish line, which just doesn't work, and it's not sustainable.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, and it's great advice. And so as we start to wrap up, can you share a bit about your personal journey to this point in your career and life? Because without, I'm trying to place your accent, and I believe yes. It's Tennessee is where I go first, so I probably am. I'm kidding.
Irish.
No, I just, because this is a topic that I want to weave in another one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, because you mentioned we have to get educated on this, right? And you've educated yourself, and now I would put you in the category of educator, you're an influencer. So not everyone is there, and there's certain presumptions, like they're embarrassed that they're not more well versed in this topic.
Yeah.
And you've gone through a lifelong journey. I've gone through a lifelong journey. It's sometimes uncomfortable, and it's sometimes just immensely rewarding and wonderful. So can you just share a bit of how you got here and how you advise others to embrace this opportunity to learn about this very important topic?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I am Irish, as you. Not from Tennessee. And I was adopted at 3 weeks old from Sri Lanka by an Irish family. So I've been raised in Ireland. My brother is also adopted.
I'm adopted.
Oh, are you actually?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
There we go.
Yeah,
Adopted people unite. Another part of intersectionality.
And where I grew up was very, very white. And it's all well and good when you're a cute brown baby, but when you get to the stage where you're not a baby anymore, you get a lot of racism. Certainly where I grew up, there was no other people of color except for my brother. Where I grew up, when there's like a traffic jam, it's because a farmer is moving his cows from one field to another. So it's rural Ireland, okay? And that changes how you view things. It changes how you see yourself when you don't see people like yourself very often, when you're the only, not white person in your entire school, and everything like that. And I grew up from on free school meals. My parents were on benefits. And so I know how difficult it can be, certainly from a financial perspective. And as I grew up and I went to university and got all of the bursaries, the grants and loans that I'm still paying off to go to university, and moved into the industry and had that, I call it a transition of privilege, because I am a senior leader. I'm well paid. I don't have any financial worries. I'm able to comfortably look after myself, and I have a partner I can talk about and so on. I have healthcare that I need and everything else. But that transition of privilege is something that I'm incredibly aware of. And from being adopted as well from a non-white country, if I cover my camera now, you can't tell I'm a person of color. I just sound like an Irish woman. So that gives me an anonymity as well. And through all of those different experiences and stuff, and being a software engineer working in a very man-dominated industry, I wanted to do something that was more than what was happening. I wanted to do something. And at that stage, I found Women Who Code, which was a small non-profit based in San Francisco. We're now the world's largest non-profit globally dedicated to women in technology, with over 230,000 members. We run free monthly meetups at all of our locations. We give over $1 million worth of scholarships per year to women in technology. And I'm now an advisory board member there. But I led our expansion across the UK and parts of EMEA. And through that work, I realized, I'm really good at this. I'm really good at making people engaged about why this is important and what we need to do. And what I would say to people is that, I'm still on a journey, even as an educator, as a published author in this space and so on. I'm still on a journey. And how I learn is I listen to people from all different backgrounds. Tools like Twitter and LinkedIn and so on are really useful in getting perceptions that you would never think about. Like, as someone who grew up in Ireland with very few people of color around me, certainly until I moved to Belfast, into a city, and then to London, I didn't have a lot of people of color that were friends, simply because of the circles that I was in. Like, my husband is a white Irishman as well. And it's important to think about the different avenues that are accessible now. The internet has given us all a wealth of information. It's about what we decide to listen to. So when you're following people from different backgrounds, reading books, that means you should buy my book as well. But reading books on inclusion, on talking about race, on allyship. There's a really great book to start off, and it's called Better Allies by Karen Caitlin. And it starts you off on that journey of actually understanding what it means to be an ally from everyday actions and going on that journey. And like I would say, like you mentioned yourself on a journey too, like there is no end to the journey, okay? It just continues and continues. And I know that can be daunting for people to not know where to start, but remember that we've all started somewhere. Like, I didn't know everything until I really immersed myself in it, and really read and learned and exposed myself, and did this work using my background to really make a difference. And certainly anybody can immerse themselves in a way that makes sense. So start off small, and the world's your oyster.
Yeah, well, Sheree, you are a treasure, not only to the space, but to the world, because this is it's not going to go away in our lifetime. It's not going to go away ever. We're always going to work to improve on this topic, particularly as people, obviously the pandemic aside, become more mobile and integrated. So thank you for your contribution. Thank you for sharing today, and look forward to talking to you again real soon. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
All right, Sheree. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.